everyone, in this video we'll be looking at the NUSPA 2023 finals motion. This house would actively incorporate the Albatross files in national education. So the rundown of today's motion breakdown will be as follows. First, we'll be looking at the info slide, how do you then define certain keywords in the motion, what category of motion does this fall under, and second, we'll be looking at case strategy for both side government and opposition. How do you set up the policy on government? How do you then preempt arguments from the other side? And last but not least, we'll be looking at the arguments that both sides can run in terms of principle, practical outcomes, and how do you do trade-offs or do certain weighings in order to win the debate. So I think the first thing that you want to do in a motion like this is to really just take a close look at the info slide, because the info slide isn't just a dump, like a dump of information, right? Oftentimes you can sort of already use the information in the info slide to sort of set up certain things in your policy, or let's say inside government. So for instance, the first sentence, which is the recently declassified letters in the Albatross files were written by Lee Kuan Yew to conduct negotiations with Malaysian authorities. That in itself is a function of what the Albatross files is trying to do. So you can look at it as certain documents, and within that document itself is a letter written by Lee Kuan Yew that signifies he is trying to negotiate with Malaysian authorities about the separation. So what you then need to know about the separation is that it was planned as early as 1965, more than a year before Singapore gained its independence in 1965. So I think here you already have sort of an inkling that this narrative posited from the Albatross files is different from what we currently understand about Singapore's separation in 1965, which is that it was not planned. Singapore was, in fact, from our understanding today, like kicked out by Malaysia because we had ideological or like political differences that we couldn't reconcile. And it was this unfortunate circumstances that then catapulted Singapore into this um vulnerable crisis state where the failed merger continues to haunt Singapore in its rather in I guess what was then a very uncertain future, or like economic trajectory ahead. So I think this impending sense of like crisis um is sort of negated when the Albatross file says that we weren't really in a crisis, right? Like you were sort of planning this all along. So knowing how this narrative differs in terms of the context is then very important, right? Because also understand the part highlighted in science, the separation was justified because it had its own pragmatic reasons like economic benefits, or that Singapore had to disentangle from communal politics. So this was the justifications given. So then I think like here, we can then move on straight into the the motion breakdown, right? So having all that in mind from what you've learned in the info slide, recognize what this motion asks you to do on government, right? So this is a this house word motion. So immediately you have to know that this is a policy motion. So is this course of action feasible or not? That's something that you have to prove. And the first thing to note is that a policy motion is a policy motion because there is an existing problem. What exactly is the existing problem? Um, the government needs to figure that out. And at the same time, you then need to justify why this policy is the solution to the problem that you posited, right? So um I think for this context, in this context of this house would actively incorporate, the word highlighted in red is important because this would then build into the policy that you have to make on government, which is what does actively incorporate look like. So there is an added nuance here. the Albatross files is a document in itself. So you can't just like have a narrative um right off of it, right? You still need to use it. So government needs to sort of explain how the albatross files will be used, for instance, for in this instance. So why is there like an added degree of actively incorporate as opposed to just normally incorporating? You then need to explain this as well. So for instance, is there like a degree of urgency involved that there is a need to actively incorporate this? Um, a few examples. Maybe actively incorporating can be something like revising this albatross narrative in our nation's textbooks like every year now and then, ensuring that the newest like updates of what historians perceive from the albatross files has to be then incorporated into the textbook. It has to be the most revisionist at all times. So that's what actively means. Or um you can also have different forms of like what actively means to you on government as long as like you justify it. For instance, it could also be like trying to um include this albatross narrative uh over the current narrative. So you can then say that we don't want our current understanding of a Singapore story. We would prefer something a bit more rooted in the alternative that the AF files is trying to say. But then you also need to then explain how these narratives will coexist, which we'll then move on and explain a little bit on later. So that's for taking the word in the motion into account. So actively incorporate. That's one burden for government. I think the second thing that site government needs to be very aware of is the phrase national education, right? I think it's quite intuitive for people to then assume that national education is just education for everyone who is living within the same nation. Assumably, they go to public schools, autonomous schools, they would then have access to things like social studies or like character citizenship education. So I guess nation curated curriculums for like nation building, for instance. So I think you as government, you don't want to sort of like um look past this immediately and not explain it because there are certain things that you can do in terms of like when you explain what actively incorporate mean um you then need to explain what exactly is a function of these national education and why it then fits nicely with actively incorporation that you are trying to say in the former, and also then also explain what national education is, who are the stakeholders involved. So instance, in this instance, it could be students in the primary school, secondary school, JC, etc. If you want to limit the policy to a certain age limit because you think that the coexistence of certain narratives is better for a certain age group, I think that's possible as well. I think the idea here is then to understand that the act of actively incorporating the albatross files has its limits because your context has to be within national education itself. So this does not include things like private education or like public education. It has to be specific within the national like education in terms of the medium that you're giving out the information on. So that leads into certain limitations of national education. Um, I guess the first limitation that you can think of is probably the idea of censorship or the fact that truths will have to be distorted for state worries or concerns of like um destabilizing societal beliefs of the current Singapore narrative, for instance. So yeah. Okay, so after you've looked at the motion and the burdens of what each word requires you to do, uh, we'll then look at certain case strategies that proposition can bring in. I think the first thing is to do setup and prop, right? So creating the policy with all the info slide and the motion breakdown in your mind, you want to create a policy that ideally preempts opposition's attacks. So for instance, you then need to explain what a status quo is, right? Before you set up your policy. So currently the albatross files are not integrated in national education. And what this looks like is in terms of social studies, students are then taught from young that the national building narrative is based on the Singapore story, where our founding fathers sort of like put their own strokes of like genius and put Singapore together into the first world country today from what was a third world country because of good leadership, etc., etc. But more importantly, how this linked into the Albatross files, which is that the origins of separation is linked to this idea of like crisis mentality that Singapore had, right? Which is sort of what made everyone get their shit together because there was a survivalist narrative that was being put in place because Singapore was kicked off from Malaysia. So I think knowing that the Albatross files then seeks to contest this narrative that Singapore was not kicked out, it seeks to then say that, well, the planning was sort of negotiated, right? I think the question that you have to ask on government and reconcile is that why is this then problematic given that these two narratives then are now on the same plate, right? Because assumably that Singapore did thrive off the survivalist narrative or crisis mentality. Does the Albatross files or like this sort of like planned separation then make it seem as if like Singapore made its own crisis? Does it then also mean that Singapore sort of um force people into this survivalist narrative without everyone's like true consent? And does this haunt us today as people who's not living in those times, but people who's reflecting on them as people who's been benefiting off like this miracle story, right? So I guess the first issue that you can think in terms of the policy is that is there an issue of transparency here? And why is ensuring transparency or like telling people truth important, and how will your policy ensure that? A second thing that you can sort of um like I guess ponder is maybe even if the truth is not out yet, sooner or later it will come to the forefront for whatever reason, right? Like maybe the academics just decided to publicize this information, or maybe for some foreign mechanism, this truth will then be out to everyone. So will procrastinating this truth be bad and will have repercussions in future? Um, etc. That's like an idea of why it could be problematic. So then this knowing all these in mind, you would then need to sort of make the policy, right? So how does the policy look like? There's three things to this. The first is to then think of the cost or risk when you incorporate Albatross files, the narrative from it in replacement of something. So I think that something is the Singapore story, right? Which is that Singapore was trusted into independence, or like the crisis mentality was organic, right? It was just sudden and no one expected it. So can these multiple narratives of like crisis mentality coexist, given that and on one hand it was sort of planned, but on the other it sort of wasn't? So could this be a problem for like the national narrative in itself? And the second thing, which is to then think in terms of the narrative, right? Like how it's then affected in terms of the cost. So, a narrative is sort of like a story, right? Like you need an origin, and then you need like the climax, and then you then have the ending. So I think the Albatross file seeks to contest the origin. So like what we said before, whether the crisis mentality was like an organic situation or not. And if it isn't, then can it really be like something that we understand today? And will it cause like existential crisis, for instance? And lastly, on government, knowing those in mind, how do you then balance these tensions using the AF files? So I think the central question on site government will be then to give a really comprehensive explanation on how the Albatross files will be used in order to reconcile these tensions. So I think putting these into application, um there is two examples of a policy that you can run here. So there are two examples. The first example is a policy that is not good. So I think teams who did not think it through enough will then say like use the Albatross files as a narrative as it is, right? They will say that well, we'll just run a narrative that Singapore is being lied to, and they would rather have a world where Singapore's survival's narrative was um just fabricated, right? The fact that it's not true. So then the team like that will then run the principal argument that, well, truth is most important, regardless of whatever circumstances, right? And then their path to victory is then to try and win this principle. the comment to this is that this will probably not be ideal because it's an extremely high burden to prove that, well, truth is what everyone in the society wants. So you as a student, you as pioneer in generation, you as a teacher, you as a state, all of you prefer truth no matter what. So I think something like this is quite hard to prove, given that opposition can just say, well, um, one, truth isn't what makes us survive nowadays. People have survived off certain incomplete truths or distorted truths as long as people are happy with whatever they have. Or they can then just say that, well, um, we just need to prove some extent of truth. We don't have to prove like complete truth. To then props case would then probably be negated to a large extent. So given that you can't run a policy like that, you can see all the preemptions why it's important now, right? So what I would suggest is the option in B, right? Which is something that's a little bit more nuanced. You can also then run on proposition in terms of the policy that, well, you're right, that opposition says that Singapore was trusted into independence. But on government, we can then say that, oh, we can still have this narrative, even if there was negotiation involved. So the burden on government here is then to explain why you can have with like this narrative of negotiation be subsumed as like secondary in terms of the story making, but still have like this trusted into independence narrative still be at the forefront, right? So what you're doing here is to reset the burden of yourself to rather than proving that, well, we have to have a complete change of narrative or like an immediate change, well, we just settle with like the inclusion of this possible narrative, right? Because let's say it's true that government wants to win on this principal idea that truth is important. Well, then we can also have this, we can also practice this principle through the inclusion or just like informing people of like a possible narrative without sort of compromising the like current narrative by through an overhaul, right? So that sort of fulfills your own burden on government without sort of like having opposition tell you why there's negative like externalities coming from it in this policy, and then try and prove why your policy isn't worth the cost. So I think moving on from this, you would then need to explain which part of the story will then change from the Albatross files and then which will maintain. So, for instance, an example is that on government, we can have sort of like a disclaimer within the same chapter in the social studies book that the AF file sort of has different narrative, but we won't go into it because historians or like the academics haven't had like the full detailed implications of it. But we're just happy with just settling with like, an inclusion of the possible like different narrative, right? So you then need to explain why having this disclaimer is enough, assuming opposition will then say that, oh, this is sort of like a soft line, right? You're not really proving the sense of urgency here. I think on government, you sort of like have this maneuver space, right? To then explain why like well, we can still not worry about those concerns because the implications of the Albatross files is still being subjected to like further study by the historians. And there is always like an incentive for these like incremental updates to then be imposed or updated within the national education itself. Like it doesn't have to be gate kept to like one academic community. It can also be like changes like at the same time. Uh yeah. So I guess here, assuming that that is like sort of a model to preempt the other side, you then need to explain why the function of national education is just enough in terms of just like informing, right? Rather than to provide a full narrative of like what AFLs is. So I think here you can also sort of explain why you still practice a certain degree of like responsible truth as the state, knowing that people possibly don't always want the full narrative at like the wrong place, wrong time, right? Or you could also have like this story at the right place and right time, and then prove why or when exactly is the right place and right time, for instance. So what then are the sort of like the arguments for proposition, right? I think one argument that you can run is why is it important for the state to be truthful, but knowing that truth is important, there are certain conditions that have to be met. So I think there's five parts here. The first is to look at what actively incorporate means, right? So for instance, there is sort of a degree of urgency, and that the problem here is that people may not want the real truth like being thrown at them. But even so, the issue then is more of the converse, right? Which is that they don't want to be lied to. So that's different from people wanting to know the real truth. What matters is that they just don't want to be lied to, right? So I guess knowing this, you then have to prove why not releasing the Albatross files or gatekeeping it, for instance, is sort of like the latter, and then prove why this truth, like principle of truth, isn't then held to the most like strongest degree, I guess. And also in the same breath, when you are explaining what does actively incorporate really look like, I think here you can then use the opportunity to explain what the conditions are. So for instance, you want actively incorporate to look like the state who is investing more time and resources to revise the position of the Albatross Files narrative into the current narrative, as opposed to them not looking at the AF at all and or just like hiding it at one side. So the reason this is important is then you can then prove why there's an incentive for the state to sort of keep up with this effort, right? To revise the position of the Albatross files within like the national education. And why exactly they have an incentive to do so probably is because like they can use like this effort as a way for them to reconcile their image of let's say past scandals or like losing trust of the electorate or the fact that they're just not very connected with the the society in general because reasons XYZ. So after you've done that, you can then compare this to the counterfactual, right? Which is why is a world with the government not doing anything about the albatross files in the national education medium then more problematic? Because probably A, it means that they are just not showing initiative, and B, they're probably not harnessing national education in the way that it's supposed to be harnessed, right? Which is that using the medium that is being controlled and taxed from the people for the people by the state. um it's unclear why well no other medium other than like through a national medium for something that pertains to everyone in the country, right, to be explained in this manner. So I think what you then have to prove here is why exactly is national education the most important way for the albatross files to be explained rather than like things like public domain, for instance. So you can also say like the reason why this is possible is because it's the only way they can hold the state accountable and follow up with like their revisions of the AF. And the reason why you can hold them accountable is that the moment they spend resources into sort of putting the AF files within the curriculum, there is this degree of irreversibility here. And it can't be taken out because once you have it in, then people will scrutinize it as part of like national education. Like parents will be looking at what their kids are learning and etc. So there is this degree of like spillover or like entrenchment, which means that the state would then need to sort of follow up and can't just like forget about it, right? I guess assuming that you did step one to three, you would then have to make the trade-off, right? Which is that um assuming you want the state to go to such lengths to incorporate the AF files, then there is going to be quite a lot of barriers or like meticulous like effort being put into it. So you can expect like slow change and also a certain likelihood of censorship due to like I guess states fearing that because knowing that when they include something into the national syllabus, it's likely to be sensationalized as compared to like public domains where everyone just says whatever they want, right? Information is democratized, but at the same time, information then no one really knows what's important, as opposed to if the state says that it's important because they included it into the syllabus. So expect slower change. So you then have to do weighing here, right? Because assuming that you agree that the state using the air files, curating it very carefully to maintain like social stability is slow, you then need to prove why this slow is good. So, one way to go about it is to prove that slow change is better because it's still at least organic. So, organic change is better because you're um following like the pace of society and whether they're ready to accept truths. And when I guess when society is more liberal, then they can be like hastening the process of the AFL's narrative being a bit more pushed at the forefront. And the structural incentives for this because there's reasons or like people among the electorate to want to take change slowly. So you can then explain why like certain demographics um within the age of like the national education itself, some of them may not be very keen to having multiple narratives, or maybe they're more conservative. And I guess this will not really apply because I guess they're more of the older generations. But I guess the point here is you want to sort of explain why people want palatable truths as opposed to like the hard truths being thrown at them. Next, in terms of practical outcomes, these are just a few examples. So, assuming that you prove that the policy is in place and that there is no like negative implication or repercussions, what are some utility benefits that you can gain out of it? The first is that probably you can get more inclusive discourse among the electorate, smarter people, more open-minded, and this is generally good because of reasons X, Y, Z. Um, Second is sort of you then remove like this fear of like the state lying to you, and that one day it will come back to haunt you. So I guess social political instability, at the heart of this argument, I guess, which is that you rather have a crippling narrative being sensationalized through national like, medium and like being controlled within the means of the national medium, as opposed to have like a foreign entity whistleblow it for you. And I think a third, which is quite interesting, and I think it's sort of like related as well, is the dimension of foreign policy, right? Which is that if the policy is done in a nuanced manner, you prevent like certain other countries from misusing the narrative. So I would say that like a disclaimer here, which is that if opposition wants to run that a different narrative will sort of like make Malaysia bully you more because they are using this against you, like you're a liar, I guess. Like that's what Malaysia can say. And if opposition wants to say this, they will then need to be very careful about proving the tipping point of their argument, given that the Albatross files is also something that's already available in the public domain. So then this, I guess, moves on to the case strategy for opposition. I guess we've set up a lot of stuff about like why the truth is important and how do you balance truths, right? For opposition, the most strategic way to go about this is not to say that truth is not important. I guess that would be like quite suicide, right? You would then probably want to agree that truth is important, but on certain conditions, right? So, for example, you can say that not all truths are desirable. You rather have one form of truth as compared to like truths in multiple various forms. So in this slide here, I use like truth X, Y, Z to sort of signpost that there's different truths coming out from one narrative, and um and there's different permutations of it. So for example, there is truth, for instance, that the Albatross file poses a different narrative to the Singapore origin. So let's call this truth X. But in the same way, or when you sort of like reference to this sentence, you can also have different permutations or understandings from it. So for instance, like in truth Y, right? Like the fact that there's also a different narrative also possibly means that there is a degree of truth that leaders were lying about the extent of the crisis. So that's truth Y. And that is inferred from truth X, right? And if we go a bit further, you can also then infer truth Z from truth X, right? Which is that this extent of helplessness, or like this crisis mentality after the separation, is sort of like fake, right? Given that it's supposedly predicted. So if this is sort of like the truth XYZ that is inevitably going to come out from the incorporation of the Albatross files, opposition will then need to prove why no matter what, no matter how much you curate the AF files, no matter how much you try to use it strategically in national medium, truth XYZ will always be the outcome, as opposed to like, even if you just want to focus on truth X. So then you can then caveat and say that, well, this is a cost that we're not going to risk, right? Given that truth XYZ is probably going to be like the reality of what you expect, even though you have like a really well-intended policy. So with that, like in place, you can then explain why truth XYZ is bad, as opposed to just having truth X, and why you would just rather have truth X on opposition, right? So there's two ways to do this. The first is to then say that contradictory premises of like these different truths are just not reconcilable in the first place, or like coexistence not possible. Because for instance, some truths in nature are just like more misleading or sensational than the other. So, for example, the truth of the AR files having a different narrative, people are not going to focus on the fact that it's negotiated, but probably more intuitive to them, something that will stick to them is that, well, the AR files basically means that the leaders were lying, right? Or like they can prove a certain degree of them being lied because they choose to not tell the complete truth, and therefore that warrants as a lie. So the fact that it can be very easily conflated into something else then proves that this narrative XYZ itself is sort of in essence like truth Y. So if that defeats the goal of said government, which is that they want truth X, then you sort of can bring in the other negative repercussions, right? Which is foreign policy repercussions, or like implications in societal like stability, for instance. And with that in mind, you would then need to prove why on your side you rather have one truth, and why is it more valuable. And even if you want to engage with the other side and say that, well, maybe truth wisely is important, how do you then get to those truths in future? Or if you're not going to get to those truths in future, how will you then trade them off? Or are they not important? So this is how you engage with like the policy aspects of proposition as opposition. So you don't seem like you're dismissing some of their stuff, which can stand at the end of the debate. And I guess the third thing to do is then to prove why there is a problem solution mismatch on proposition. So knowing that these contradictory premises are not like reconcilable in the first place, you would then have to then prove that national education is just structurally never able to include truth XYZ without negative implications. So then you have to explain what these negative implications are, and you then see this in the next slide. Yep, so negative implications, right? So they are just consequences of the limitations of national education. So what exactly is a national education? This goes back to the function of national education, right? Which is that it's not just about educating kids. It's also having like a simple narrative for them to follow. So in terms of like the cost of like the quality of education for the kids, is there really a worth in having them explore these different narratives? And will it stay? So if it doesn't stay, then what's the point? Or if it doesn't stay, then what else would happen? So there could be a cost here for like, I don't know, things like national pride, disillusionment. Personally, I feel like this is a very small limitation or like argument. I wouldn't really focus on this, but um, having that in mind, I guess the more important angle that you can take is that you disagree with the action of actively incorporate, right? Which is that maybe on opposition, we rather include the truth later on rather than now. Because there is sort of like the essence of time, right? Which is that the narrative, the ability for a narrative to stay within a country is dependent on the right time and right place. So you then have to give structural reasons for why this promise of like this narrative being able to sustain in future will happen in time, and not just like what proposition sort of preempted, right? Which is that governments would then um retreat into idleness or just not take initiative then. So for example, on opposition, you can say that government would rather have a complete, more palatable narrative at one go. So that takes away the incentive or whatever accusation that governments would prefer to not talk about the Albatross files. We can also like be a bit more strategic and sort of like flip this premise that the AF files is just in nature bad for the state, right? Given that the central question is how you use the Albatross files, the opposition can also say that, well, we can have the state wait for like academics or like historians to make the narrative more complete and palatable, but also have like a degree of truth that won't hurt the social political stability, but rather, even better, they can use the narrative from the AR files, once completed by the academics and historians, to paint themselves as like being more transformed, or paint themselves as being like, wow, they're finally telling the truth and it's such a brave thing for them. And this more pragmatic or like nuanced AF narrative, um, as a more complete form, is much better than the sort of like the way the truth is being like brought out in proposition, right? Which is like it's sort of like incomplete. It's like a premature like updates like over time. So um you then have to prove why you prefer the former and why this is important. So like an example can be like there is a very important like gravity in terms of like how we expose truths, because truths, when you expose them the right way and right time, they can be um really beneficial in terms of like utility, for instance. And why is this important can also be for reasons like, well, there is sort of an urgency for like electorates to feel like wowed by the state, right? Like, wow, they're finally like doing something um that we admire, right? And there is an illusion of like proving themselves and their worth, show like this complete narrative being sold onto them, as opposed to like just being thrown onto them, not strategically, not tactfully, or like in a very tone deaf manner. And also, maybe the reason why there is a need for them to feel wild is because of like you can use the context of like Singapore, right? Like the loss of like Lee Kuan Yew in 2015, it's a national pride and icon, which means that now more than ever there is a need for a sudden story to rejuvenate the country all over again, right? And um if this is important and there is a benefit to this, you then need to prove why this is likely or important. Sorry, why this is more possible or likely. In a sense that I guess there could be more incentive for the state to censor narratives in the public domain, given that they are not controlled or like they're probably out there to um be used against a state. So you essentially have a state that is structurally incentivized to be more defensive, as opposed to if you just have them like work it out like nicely within get kept within the academic domain. You then have like less distracted discourse in the public domain and have more discourse in the academic domain, where you can just translate the information much better with less I guess barriers or um like obstacles, I guess. And I think for this part here, yep, so for this part here, this is an extension on after you've proven that well uh people don't really want truths being shown onto them, but people want palatable truths. And the second extension to this is that on opposition, you can then sort of, well, this is like a high risk, high reward thing, which is then to prove why um the cost of having the AFLs within the national narrative or national education is not going to be worth it at all cost. So the one way to look at this is then to look at foreign policy, right? Which is that it's a narrative that could be weaponized against Singapore. And the argument here is sort of like very speculative in nature, right? So then you have to sort of like be very careful with the premises that you set up for this. So I guess the way to prove about this is that knowing that the air force can be used against Singapore, you then need to prove why Malaysia wouldn't have the incentive to use this against them. So assumably it's something that's already in the public domain, you then sort of like be a bit more aware that why isn't it being used now today then. Um you can sort of like preempt this from government, right? So one way to go about it is to prove the significance of national education, right? Which is that it itself is a medium of that could also be perceived as national propaganda. And given that it's sort of like national propaganda or it's something that's created by the state or it's sort of like confirmed by it, it has the authority of the state now, and that they are sort of like legitimizing this narrative from the AF. And given that this is true, you then enter the dimension of foreign policy, right? Because how other countries perceive Singapore will be then through its own like policies being in place. And if it's true that the air force is then being used in national education, it then sort of enters the dimension of foreign policy, right? And that's how you bring in the idea of like Malaysia trying to possibly use the air force against Singapore as a possible um like I guess outcome. And I want to note here that this argument here is probably going to be like quite a high impact, but very low likelihood for the reasons that we've already said, right? Like it's something that is already in public domain. So if opposition wants to run this point, they would then need to be very careful about the tipping point, right? And then prove why this tipping point is likely going to be tipped on like government side as opposed to like on opposition. So I think to prove this, you can go about it in like four steps, right? Which is number one, the reason why like SGMR relations continue to be compromised is that fundamentally like nation states are just driven by like the need for power and to like I don't know, maximize resources. And the reason why this Albatross files is a narrative is important is because it was sort of like this survivalist narrative that Singapore like sort of made itself known to everyone else that sort of kickstarted trade relations or like water agreements um with like the neighbors at the time, right? So for instance, the water agreement were on like the water agreement and like territorial like disputes, they were sort of like contingent on Malaysia's like sympathy that they were sort of like kicked out, right? And I think Singapore sort of played into this narrative like intentionally, by justifying its like mandate, right, or national service, the fact that they've been just kicked out from the country that was what they thought would be like stable for them. And now they suddenly are investing so much in defenses, investing so much in like getting this survivalist narrative together, therefore having national service in place. And suddenly security dimensions coming to the forefront in Singapore through like the ISA. These are all like outcomes that was premised on like Malaysia's contribution as the person who kicked like this poor thing out, right? And I think after establishing this context, the part C is then important, right? You can then bring in why Malaysia's like foreign policy is sort of like a result of Singapore's like sudden like change in their own domestic policies. So recognize that like foreign policy is like a domino effect, right? Like everyone's connected to one another, we're adapting to one another's like behaviors as countries. Um, Malaysia could also then like use this narrative that well, if Singapore was sort of lying to themselves at the point of time, then what we did as opposed to trying to adapt to them was sort of like us being played as well, right? So there is sort of like a degree of unintended cost here because of like Singapore's non-organic way of like conducting their own affairs, for instance. So if I guess this goes into like the principle of like truth in like the foreign policy dimension. But I think most importantly to prove why like ABC is important is then to then say that this affects Malaysia's bargaining power with Singapore over disputes today. So given that foreign policy is based on like personalities and like trust between nations and like things at the higher level, right? Um if this narrative hits a certain tipping point that gives leaders a reason to not trust Singapore, then surely we then lose like bargaining power. And this affects Singapore because we're like a country that's very dependent on trade, very dependent on socialization and like regionalism and engaging in like discourse and being nice to everyone, like I guess friends to all, enemy of none kind of thing. So this is like the four-way step that you need to prove in order to then reach the threshold of then saying that Malaysia can misuse this narrative. Um, I want to then also remind that this argument in itself is like kind of like a high risk, low reward thing. The the individual components of this like argument is quite important as well. And I guess what's important, even if you don't execute this, is the thought process, which is how you respond to the policy on proposition, and also just coming out with your own like outcomes or like negative repercussions, which is what opposition is trying to do here, which is just to prove why the cost isn't worth it. So with that said, I hope this has been helpful to people. If I was unclear at any point of time, just feel free to reach out to me. Um, I feel very strongly for this motion, and I hope it was a fruitful motion for people to debate about as well. So with that said, thank you for listening. Have a nice day. Bye bye.